somewhere in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, in the early hours of October 12, 1492, a sailor named Rodrigo de Triana climbed to the crow's nest of a ship called the Pinta and stared into the darkness ahead. The fleet had been at sea for 33 days. The crew was exhausted, frightened, and by most accounts on the edge of open revolt. Some men had stopped believing they would ever see land again. Others had begun to whisper that their captain was either a madman or a liar, and that both possibilities led to the same end, death in an ocean that had no bottom and no shore. Then Rodrigo saw something. A white cliff, moonlight catching on sand. Land. He screamed the word into the night, tierra, tierra, and in that single moment, without knowing it, without any possible understanding of what he had set in motion, one sailor's shout divided human history into a before and an after. What happened next would be called a discovery. It would also be called a catastrophe. It would produce the modern world as we know it, its trade routes, its languages, its foods, its diseases, its inequalities, its very borders. And it all began with a man who was almost certainly wrong about where he was, who died still insisting he had reached Asia, and who never once set foot on the continent that would eventually be named after someone else entirely. This is the story of Christopher Columbus, and it is far more complicated than any statue or any condemnation can contain. To understand Columbus, you have to understand the world he was born into, because that world was obsessed with a problem, and Columbus was convinced he had the solution. The problem was trade, specifically the trade in spices. Today, when we think of spices, we think of something pleasant, something you add to food for flavor. But in 15th century Europe, spices were not a luxury. They were closer to a necessity. Black pepper, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, these were used to preserve food, to mask the taste of meat that had begun to turn, to make medicines, to produce perfumes and dyes. They were worth extraordinary sums of money. A single sack of pepper could pay a man's wages for a year. Cloves were so valuable that wars were fought over the islands where they grew. And all of those spices came from the east, from India, from the spice islands of Southeast Asia, from the trade networks that stretched across the Indian Ocean. They traveled overland through Central Asia and the Middle East, passing through dozens of hands, each one taking a cut, until they arrived in the ports of Venice and Genoa at prices that had multiplied many times over from their origin. Then, in 1453, something happened that made this already expensive situation dramatically worse. The Ottoman Turks captured Constantinople. The Byzantine Empire, the eastern remnant of Rome, which had survived for 1,000 years after Rome itself fell, was gone in a single afternoon. The Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II rode his horse into the Hagia Sophia, the greatest church in Christendom, and had it converted into a mosque, and the overland trade routes to Asia, already difficult, became significantly more complicated and expensive for European merchants. Europe needed another way to reach the east. It needed a sea route. The Portuguese had been working on this problem for decades. Under the patronage of Prince Henry the Navigator, a man who, somewhat ironically, almost never went to sea himself, Portuguese sailors had been pushing further and further south along the coast of Africa, mapping the continent, establishing trading posts, searching for the point where the continent ended and the open ocean began. In 1488, Bartolomeu Dias rounded the Cape of Good Hope. A decade later, Vasco da Gama would complete the journey and reach India by sailing around Africa entirely. But Columbus had a different idea. And his idea, he was certain, was better. Columbus was born in Genoa, probably in 1451, the son of a weaver. He went to sea young, as many Genoese boys did, and over the following decades he became an experienced and capable sailor. He sailed to England, possibly to Iceland, along the African coast. He read voraciously. His copy of Marco Polo's travels survives to this day, covered in his own handwritten annotations in the margins. He was, by any measure, an intelligent and ambitious man. He was also, on one crucial point, completely wrong. Columbus believed the earth was small, not flat. Educated Europeans in the 15th century knew perfectly well that the earth was round. The ancient Greeks had calculated this, and the calculation had never been lost. What Columbus got wrong was the size. He believed the circumference of the earth was roughly 25,000 kilometers. The actual figure is closer to 40,000. He also believed Asia extended much further east than it actually does, which meant, in his calculations, that the distance from the Canary Islands to Japan was only about 4,400 kilometers. The actual distance, sailing west from the Canaries, is roughly 20,000 kilometers. Columbus was off by a factor of nearly 5. The Portuguese court, to whom he first presented his plan, rejected it. Not because they thought the earth was flat, but because their own geographers calculated, correctly, that the western route to Asia was far too long for any ship to survive. Columbus was furious. He was certain they were wrong. He would spend the next several years trying to convince someone, anyone, to fund his voyage. He went to Spain. He presented his case to King Ferdinand of Aragon and Queen Isabella of Castile, the monarchs who had just completed the Reconquista, the centuries-long campaign to retake the Iberian Peninsula from Muslim rulers, and who had, in the same year, expelled all Jews from Spain in one of the largest forced migrations in medieval European history. Ferdinand and Isabella were not, at this moment, in a particularly cautious or conservative mood. They had just unified their kingdoms through marriage, conquered the last Muslim stronghold at Granada, and were looking for ways to expand Spanish power and wealth into a world that was clearly, visibly changing. They were interested, but they were also cautious. A royal commission studied Columbus's proposal and reached the same conclusion as the Portuguese. The numbers didn't add up. The ocean was too wide. Columbus was rejected again. He was on his way to France to try his luck there, when a messenger caught up with him on the road and told him to come back. Isabella had changed her mind. Why? The honest answer is that we don't know for certain. Some historians emphasize the role of Luis de Santangel, a court official who argued passionately for the project. Some point to the fact that the cost was relatively modest. Columbus was asking for ships, supplies, and a share of any profits, not a vast army. Some suggest Isabella was motivated by genuine religious conviction, a belief that spreading Christianity to new peoples was a sacred duty. Almost certainly, it was a combination of all of these things. Whatever the reason, Columbus got his ships, 3 of them, the Santa Maria, the Pinta, and the Nina. He got roughly 90 men. He got a contract, the capitulations of Santa Fe, that granted him the title of Admiral of the Ocean Sea, the rank of Viceroy over any lands he discovered, and 10% of all revenues from those lands. It was an extraordinarily generous deal. It was also, from the Spanish crown's perspective, a very low-risk gamble. If Columbus failed, they lost 3 ships and some provisions. If he succeeded, Spain would have a new route to Asia. On August 3, 1492, the fleet left the port of Palos de la Frontera. Columbus was 40 years old. He would never see Spain again as the same man who left it. The voyage west was But as the weeks stretched on, the mood on the ships changed. The men had expected to reach land within a few weeks at most. When they didn't, fear began to set in. The compass needles were behaving strangely. They were crossing the zone of magnetic declination, where magnetic north and true north diverge, and the sailors had never seen this before. They were entering the Sargasso Sea with its strange floating mats of seaweed, which some men took as a sign that the ocean was becoming shallow and impassable. The winds shifted. There were, according to later accounts, discussions of mutiny. Some historians are skeptical about how serious these discussions were. Columbus himself may have exaggerated the threat to make his eventual success seem more dramatic. But there is no doubt that the tension was real. 33 days at sea, out of sight of land, with no guarantee of return, was a genuinely terrifying experience for men who had never sailed beyond the familiar waters of the European coast. On October 11th, the day before landfall, Columbus had already promised the crew that if they didn't sight land within 3 days, he would turn back. Whether he would actually have kept this promise is another question historians debate. It didn't matter. The next morning, Rodrigo de Triana saw his white cliff in the moonlight. There is a cruel footnote to this moment. Columbus had promised a reward, a lifetime pension, to the first man who sighted land. But Columbus later claimed that he himself had seen a light the previous evening, which he interpreted as a sign of land. On the basis of this claim, he took the reward for himself. Rodrigo de Triana, the man who actually saw the land, received nothing. Some accounts say he eventually converted to Islam and spent the rest of his life in North Africa, bitter and forgotten. Whether this is true or a later embellishment is unclear. But the story captures something real about the nature of Columbus's character. He was capable of extraordinary vision and extraordinary pettiness in equal measure. The island they had reached was in the Bahamas. Columbus called it San Salvador. The people who already lived there called it Guanahani. They were the Taino, a people who had inhabited the Caribbean islands for centuries, who had sophisticated agricultural practices, complex social structures, and a way of life that had developed entirely independently of anything happening in Europe, Africa, or Asia. Columbus's account of his first meeting with the Taino is one of the most famous and most troubling passages in the history of exploration. He describes them as gentle, generous, and beautiful. He notes that they brought gifts and seemed eager to please. He observes that they have no iron weapons. And then, in the same breath, almost in the same sentence, he writes that they would make excellent servants, and that with 50 men, he could subjugate them all. This is not a later interpretation or a reading between the lines. Columbus wrote it himself, in his own log, on the day he met them. The impulse toward wonder and the impulse toward domination arrived together, inseparable, from the very first moment. Columbus spent the next several weeks sailing through the Caribbean, visiting island after island, searching for the gold and the spices that would prove he had reached Asia. The Taino kept pointing him further along, indicating that there was more gold somewhere to the south and west. Columbus followed these indications, partly because he wanted to find the gold, and partly because he was desperate to find evidence that he had reached the Asian mainland, a city, a palace, a ruler wealthy enough to match the descriptions in Marco Polo's book. He found Cuba, which he initially believed might be Japan. He found Hispaniola, the island now divided between Haiti and the Dominican Republic, where there was genuine gold in the rivers, and where the local chief, a man named Guacanagari, received him with remarkable hospitality. On Christmas Eve, the Santa Maria ran aground on a reef and was wrecked. Columbus used the timber from the ship to build a small fort, which he called La Navidad, the Nativity, and left 39 men there to hold it while he sailed back to Spain. He returned to a hero's welcome. Ferdinand and Isabella received him in state. He brought parrots, plants, gold ornaments, and, most controversially, 10 Taino people whom he had taken from their homes and brought to Spain as living proof of his discovery. 6 of them survived the voyage. They were baptized. They were displayed at court. Columbus was confirmed in all his titles and given the resources for a second, much larger voyage. The story he told Spain, and told Europe, was the story of a paradise found. Gentle people, abundant land, gold waiting to be collected. It was a story designed to attract investment and settlers. It was also, in crucial ways, a story that omitted what Columbus knew and what he had written in his own log, that this paradise would have to be taken by force. Now here is where the story becomes impossible to tell without confronting what happened next. Because what happened next was not an accident, not an unforeseen consequence, not a tragedy that nobody could have predicted. It was the result of specific decisions made by specific people, including Columbus himself. On his second voyage, Columbus arrived with 17 ships and over 1,000 men. He arrived with horses, dogs, and weapons. He arrived with the intention of establishing a permanent colony and extracting wealth. When he reached La Navidad, he found it burned to the ground. The 39 men he had left behind were dead. Exactly what happened is disputed. Spanish accounts blame Taino violence, while the evidence suggests the Spanish men had been raiding villages and taking women, and the Taino had responded. Whatever the precise sequence of events, the pattern that would define the next century was already established. Spanish demands, Taino resistance, Spanish retaliation. Columbus established a new settlement, which he called La Isabela, and began the process of organizing the colony. He imposed a tribute system. Every Taino adult in certain regions was required to deliver a set quantity of gold every 3 months. Those who failed to deliver were punished severely. Columbus sent shipments back to Spain, gold, cotton, and increasingly, enslaved Taino people, whom he proposed to sell in the markets of Seville. Isabella, to her credit, was disturbed by the enslavement. She considered the Taino to be subjects of the Spanish crown, not property, and she repeatedly objected to Columbus's slave trading. Columbus largely ignored her objections when he could. The colony was, by most measures, a disaster. Columbus was a brilliant navigator and a visionary planner, but he was a terrible administrator. He was autocratic, vindictive, and incapable of managing the competing ambitions of the Spanish settlers, who had come expecting to get rich quickly. He hanged men for minor offenses. He cut off the hands of those who failed to meet their gold quotas. He played favorites and made enemies. Within a few years, multiple complaints had reached Spain about his governance, and in 1500, a royal investigator named Francisco de Bobadilla arrived in Hispaniola, found conditions so appalling that he had Columbus arrested and sent back to Spain in chains. Columbus was eventually released. Ferdinand and Isabella restored his titles, though not his governorship, but he never recovered his former status. He made 2 more voyages, exploring the coast of Central and South America, still searching for the passage to Asia, still insisting that he was close to the wealth of the Great Khan. He died in 1506, in Valladolid, Spain, probably in his mid-50s, still believing, or at least still claiming, that he had reached the outskirts of Asia. He was not poor at his death. He had accumulated significant wealth. But he was bitter, convinced that he had been cheated of the recognition and the rewards he deserved. He had not, of course, reached Asia. And the continent he had reached was already being called by a different name. In 1507, a German cartographer named Martin Waldseemüller published a world map that included, for the first time, a large landmass in the Western Hemisphere. He labeled it America after the Italian explorer Amerigo Vespucci, who had sailed along the coast of South America and, crucially, had published accounts clearly arguing that this was not Asia but a new continent, previously unknown to Europeans. Columbus had never made this argument publicly, even if he may have privately suspected it. Vespucci did. And so the continent got Vespucci's name, not Columbus's. The irony is almost too neat to be true, but it is true. Now let's step back from the individual story and look at what Columbus's voyages actually set in motion, because the consequences were not just large, they were arguably the largest single set of consequences in human history since the development of agriculture. The first and most immediate consequence was what historians call the Columbian Exchange. This was the transfer of plants, animals, diseases, and people between the eastern and western hemispheres that began in 1492 and continued for centuries. It was, in both directions, transformative. From the Americas to Europe and the rest of the world went potatoes, tomatoes, corn, chocolate, tobacco, vanilla, rubber, sunflowers, peanuts, and dozens of other crops. The potato alone is credited with enabling the population explosion in Europe in the 17th and 18th centuries. It was a more reliable and calorie-dense crop than anything previously grown in Northern Europe, and it transformed the diets and the demographics of countries like Ireland, Germany, and Russia. The tomato, now inseparable from Italian cuisine, did not arrive in Italy until the 16th century. The chili pepper, central to the cuisines of India, Thailand, and China, is an American plant. When you eat a plate of pasta with tomato sauce, or a bowl of Thai curry, or a plate of chips, you are eating food that was made possible by Columbus's voyages. From Europe and Africa to the Americas went horses, cattle, pigs, sheep, wheat, rice, sugarcane, and most devastatingly diseases. This is the part of the Columbian Exchange that is hardest to absorb because the scale of it is almost incomprehensible. The indigenous peoples of the Americas had no prior exposure to smallpox, measles, influenza, typhus, cholera, or dozens of other diseases that were endemic in the Old World. Over thousands of years, populations in Europe, Africa, and Asia had developed some degree of immunity to these diseases, not complete immunity, but enough that the diseases, while deadly, did not wipe out entire populations. The peoples of the Americas had none of this immunity. They had been geographically isolated for roughly 15,000 years. When European diseases arrived in the Americas, the effect was catastrophic beyond any modern parallel. Epidemics swept through populations that had no resistance. Some historians estimate that in the century following Columbus's first voyage, somewhere between 50 and 90% of the indigenous population of the Americas died. The numbers are genuinely uncertain. We don't have reliable population counts from before contact, but even the most conservative estimates describe a demographic collapse of staggering proportions. In Hispaniola, where Columbus first established his colony, the Taino population has been estimated at anywhere from several 100,000 to several million people in 1492. By 1548, barely 50 years later, a Spanish priest named Bartolomé de las Casas, who had witnessed the destruction firsthand and spent his life trying to document and oppose it, reported that the Taino were effectively gone. Not diminished. Gone. An entire people, with their languages, their knowledge, their stories, their ways of understanding the world, erased within a human lifetime. This was not solely the result of disease. Forced labor, violence, displacement, and the destruction of food systems all contributed. But disease was the largest single factor. And it is important to understand that the spread of disease was not a deliberate policy. It was an unintended consequence of contact. This does not make it less tragic. It does not diminish the responsibility of those who imposed forced labor and violence on weakened populations, but it is a crucial distinction for understanding what happened. The demographic collapse of indigenous populations had another consequence that is rarely discussed but was enormously significant. It created the conditions for the transatlantic slave trade. The Spanish colonizers needed labor. They had come to extract wealth from the Americas: gold, silver, agricultural products, and they needed people to do the work. Initially, they enslaved indigenous people, but as indigenous populations collapsed, the labor shortage became acute. The solution the colonizers reached for was the importation of enslaved Africans. The transatlantic slave trade, which would eventually transport somewhere between 12 and 15 million people from Africa to the Americas over the course of roughly 4 centuries, was not an inevitable consequence of Columbus's voyages. It was a choice, made by specific people for specific economic reasons, but it was a choice made possible by the world that Columbus's voyages had created. The connection between 1492 and the centuries of African slavery in the Americas is not a metaphor or an analogy. It is a direct causal chain. Columbus himself enslaved indigenous people. He did not create the transatlantic slave trade that developed after his death, but he established the template, a colonial system in which the labor of non-European people was treated as a resource to be extracted and in which violence was the primary tool of enforcement. Here is where the historical picture becomes genuinely complex and where it is worth pausing to think carefully about how we evaluate historical figures. Columbus was a man of his time. This is true, and it matters. The idea that enslaving conquered peoples was wrong, not just strategically unwise or economically inefficient, but morally wrong, was not a mainstream view in 15th century Europe. Slavery had existed in virtually every human civilization throughout recorded history. The Catholic Church, which was the dominant moral authority in Columbus's world, had not condemned slavery as an institution. Columbus's willingness to enslave the Taino was consistent with the norms of his era. But, and this is equally important, Columbus was not simply following norms. He was making choices. He was making choices that his own queen objected to. He was making choices that contemporaries like Bartolomé de las Casas explicitly condemned. The moral critique of Columbus did not have to wait for the 21st century. It was being made in the 16th century by people who had access to the same facts he did. And Columbus's navigational genius, his courage, his persistence, his willingness to sail into an unknown ocean on the basis of a calculation that everyone told him was wrong, these are also real. They are not diminished by the violence that followed. A person can be both genuinely remarkable and genuinely responsible for terrible things. Most of the figures who shaped history were. The question of how to think about Columbus is, in a sense, a question about how we think about history itself. Do we judge historical figures by the standards of their own time? By the standards of ours? By the standards of those they harmed, who had their own standards? There is no clean answer. But the question is worth sitting with, because the discomfort it produces is itself historically instructive. What Columbus actually discovered, and this is perhaps the most important reframing of his story, was not a new world. It was a world that was already inhabited by tens of millions of people, with thousands of years of history, culture, and civilization. The Americas were not empty. They were not waiting to be found. They were simply unknown to Europeans, which is a very different thing. The word discovery is one that historians have increasingly questioned for exactly this reason. Columbus did not discover America. He established contact between two hemispheres that had been separated for 15,000 years. That contact was genuinely world-changing, perhaps the most consequential single event in the last 500 years of human history. But calling it a discovery erases the people who were already there, and erasing them was, in a sense, the first act of the colonial project that followed. There is also a geopolitical dimension to Columbus's voyages that is easy to overlook, but was enormously consequential. The Spanish crown's claim to the Western Hemisphere, based on Columbus's voyages, set off a scramble among European powers that would shape the world for the next 5 centuries. In 1494, Spain and Portugal signed the Treaty of Tordesillas, dividing the non-European world between them along a line drawn through the Atlantic. Everything to the west of the line would belong to Spain. Everything to the east would belong to Portugal. This is why Brazil, which lies east of the line, speaks Portuguese today, while the rest of Latin America speaks Spanish. The treaty was brokered by the Pope, who apparently felt entitled to divide the world between two Catholic kingdoms, and it was ignored by England, France, and the Netherlands as soon as those countries developed the naval power to challenge it. The result was centuries of colonial competition, war, and empire building that would eventually cover virtually the entire globe. The British Empire, the French Empire, the Dutch colonial system, the Belgian Congo, the Spanish and Portuguese empires in the Americas, all of these, in different ways, trace their origins to the precedent set in 1492, that a European power could claim sovereignty over distant lands on the basis of having sent ships there first. The silver mines of Potosi, in what is now Bolivia, discovered in 1545, became the largest single source of silver in the world. At their peak, they produced roughly 60% of all the silver mined globally. That silver flowed into Spain, then into the European economy, and then through trade into the economies of China and India, fundamentally reshaping global commerce. Some historians argue that the silver of the Americas was the financial foundation of the first genuinely global economy. Others argue that it also caused the inflation that destabilized Spain and contributed to its eventual decline. Both things are probably true. The crops of the Americas, the potato, the corn, the sweet potato, fed population growth in Europe, Africa, and Asia. The potato in particular enabled the survival of millions of people in climates where other crops failed. Some historians have argued, provocatively, that the Industrial Revolution in Britain was partly enabled by the potato, because it freed agricultural labor for industrial work. This is a large claim, and a contested one, but it illustrates the kind of long-range consequence that flows from 1492. Tobacco, another American crop, created one of the first global consumer markets and one of the first global public health crises. Sugarcane, brought to the Americas by Columbus himself on his second voyage, became the engine of the plantation economy and the primary driver of the transatlantic slave trade. The connection between a plant and a crime against humanity is direct and traceable. The languages of the Americas, hundreds of them, representing thousands of years of linguistic development, were largely destroyed over the following centuries as colonial powers imposed Spanish, Portuguese, English, French, and Dutch. Some survived in reduced and altered forms, many did not. The loss of a language is the loss of a way of understanding the world, and it is irreversible. The indigenous civilizations of the Americas, the Aztec Empire, the Inca Empire, the Maya, the Mississippian cultures of North America, the Iroquois Confederacy, and hundreds of others, were disrupted, conquered, or destroyed in the century following Columbus's first voyage. Some of them had achieved remarkable things. The Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan, when the Spanish arrived in 1519, was one of the largest cities in the world, with a population larger than any city in Europe at the time. It had a sophisticated water system, a market that astonished the Spanish soldiers who saw it, and this is the tension that makes Columbus's story so difficult to resolve. The world that emerged from this catastrophe is also the world we live in. The foods we eat, the languages we speak, the economic systems we inhabit, the political borders that define our nations, all of these were shaped, directly or indirectly, by what began in 1492. The catastrophe and the modern world are not separate things. They are the same thing, seen from different angles. How do we hold this? How do we think about a single man, a skilled sailor, a determined visionary, a brutal colonizer, a man who was wrong about where he was going and right about the fact that he could get there, whose voyages produced both the most consequential agricultural revolution in human history and one of the largest demographic catastrophes in human history? The honest answer is that we hold it with difficulty. We hold it by resisting the temptation to simplify. Columbus was not a hero who discovered a new world and brought civilization to savages. He was also not a uniquely evil man whose crimes define everything that followed. He was a human being, ambitious, courageous, cruel, visionary, petty, and profoundly consequential, operating within a system that was larger than him, making choices that were genuinely his own, and setting in motion forces that he could not have imagined and did not live to see. The statues of Columbus that have been pulled down in recent years and the statues that remain standing are both responding to a real problem, the question of who we choose to honor and what we choose to commemorate. These are legitimate questions for any society to ask, but they are different questions from the historical ones. The historical questions are, what happened, why did it happen, and what did it produce? Those questions deserve careful, honest answers, not because Columbus deserves rehabilitation, but because the people who were harmed by what he set in motion deserve to have their story told accurately, which means telling the full story, including the parts that are complicated and uncomfortable. There is one more figure in this story who deserves more than a passing mention, because he represents something important about the possibility of moral clarity in the midst of historical catastrophe. Bartolomé de las Casas was born in Seville in 1484. His father had sailed with Columbus on the second voyage. Bartolomé himself went to Hispaniola as a young man, participated in the colonial system, and was initially given an encomienda, a grant of indigenous labor, like any other Spanish settler. He was a priest, but that had not initially troubled his conscience about the system he was part of. Then, in 1514, something changed. Las Casas later wrote that while preparing a sermon, he read a passage from the book of Sirach, "The bread of the needy is their life, he that defraudeth him thereof is a man of blood." He could not get it out of his mind. He gave back his encomienda. He spent the next 50 years, until his death in 1566, documenting the destruction of indigenous peoples and arguing, before the Spanish crown, before the Pope, before anyone who would listen, that what was being done in the Americas was a moral catastrophe of the first order. His book, A Short Account of the Destruction of the Indies, written in 1542, is one of the most extraordinary documents in the history of human rights. It is graphic, passionate, and deliberately one-sided. Las Casas was writing advocacy, not balanced history, but it was based on what he had witnessed, and it was effective. It contributed to the new laws of 1542, which attempted, with limited success, to reform the colonial system and protect indigenous people. Las Casas is not a simple hero either. He initially suggested, as a solution to the labor shortage caused by indigenous population collapse, that African slaves be imported instead. He later recanted this suggestion and condemned African slavery as equally unjust, but the original suggestion was made and it had consequences. Even the people who saw most clearly in this period were not entirely free of the assumptions of their world. But Las Casas represents something crucial, the fact that moral clarity was possible in 1542. The argument that Columbus and the colonizers were simply products of their time, that nobody could have known better, is contradicted by the existence of Las Casas, who knew better, said so publicly, and paid a significant personal price for doing so. History is not made only by the powerful, it is also made by those who resist, who document, who insist on bearing witness. Las Casas's writings survived. They shaped the debate about indigenous rights for centuries. They are still read today. In a story full of erasure, that survival matters. So where does this leave us? 530 years after Rodrigo de Triana's shout in the darkness. The world that Columbus's voyages created is, in many ways, the world we inhabit. the global economy, the movement of people and goods across oceans, the mixing of cultures and crops and languages, these are all, in part, consequences of what began in 1492. The inequality that structures that world, the wealth of some nations and the poverty of others, the legacies of colonial extraction, the demographics of the Americas is also, in part, a consequence of what began in 1492. Columbus himself is a figure who resists easy judgment, not because he was morally neutral, but because he was morally complex in ways that are genuinely instructive. He was capable of writing, in the same sentence, that the people he had just met were beautiful and generous, and that he could enslave them all with 50 men. This is not a contradiction that belongs only to Columbus. It is a contradiction that runs through the history of European expansion and through the history of modernity itself, the simultaneous celebration of human possibility and the denial of full humanity to specific groups of people. Understanding Columbus clearly, neither as a hero nor as a monster, but as a human being whose choices had consequences that he could not have imagined, is not just an exercise in historical accuracy. It is a way of understanding how the world we live in came to be. And understanding how the world came to be is the first step toward understanding what it might yet become. The ocean that Rodrigo de Triana stared into on the night of October 11, 1492, was not, as Columbus believed, the edge of the known world. It was the beginning of a new one. What kind of world that would be, who would benefit from it, who would be destroyed by it, and who would eventually be asked to reckon with it, was not determined in that moment. It was determined by the choices that followed. As it always is, if this video made you think about history differently, about the way a single voyage can change everything, about the gap between intention and consequence, about the people whose names we remember and the people we forget, then leave a comment below. I genuinely want to know, how do you think about Columbus? Hero, villain, or something more complicated? There is no wrong answer, and the debate in the comments is always one of the best parts of making these videos. If you are new here, this channel is dedicated to exactly this kind of history, the stories that are bigger and stranger and more morally complex than the versions we learned in school. Subscribe if that sounds like something you want more of, and hit the bell so you do not miss the next one. And if you want to stay in this part of history, the age of exploration, the collision of worlds, the empires that rose and fell on the back of what Columbus started, the next video is already waiting for you. It is about the man who arrived in Mexico in 1519 with 600 soldiers and brought down an empire of millions. That story is, if anything, even more complicated than this one. I will see you there. Actually, let's pause before the call to action, because there is one dimension of Columbus's legacy that tends to get lost in the debate between celebration and condemnation, and it may be the most important dimension of all for understanding the world we live in today. It is the question of what was lost and whether any of it can be recovered. When the Spanish arrived in the Caribbean and then on the American mainland, they encountered not a blank slate, but a living archive. The peoples of the Americas had spent 15,000 years developing knowledge about plants, about weather, about astronomy, about medicine, about agriculture, about ecosystems. This was not primitive knowledge. It was sophisticated, tested, accumulated across generations, and perfectly adapted to environments that European science would not fully understand for centuries. The Aztecs had botanical gardens that European visitors described with astonishment. They cultivated hundreds of varieties of corn, each adapted to different altitudes and climates, representing thousands of years of selective breeding. The Inca had an agricultural terracing system in the Andes that allowed farming at altitudes where nothing should, by European standards, have been able to grow. The Maya had developed a calendar more accurate than the one in use in Europe, and an astronomical knowledge so precise that their calculations of planetary cycles were correct to fractions of a degree. Most of this knowledge was never written down in a form that Europeans could read. Some of it was recorded in indigenous scripts. The Maya had a fully developed writing system, and the Aztecs had pictographic records, but Spanish priests, convinced that these documents were the work of the devil, burned them. In 1562, a Franciscan friar named Diego de Landa oversaw the burning of virtually every Maya book in the Yucatan. He later wrote, with apparent satisfaction, that he had destroyed a great number of books, and that since they contained nothing but superstitions and the devil's falsehoods, he had burned them all. Only 4 Maya codices are known to have survived. What was in those books? We will never know. Medical knowledge, astronomical observations, historical records, religious texts, agricultural manuals, all of it gone in an afternoon's fire. The loss is incalculable, not in a rhetorical sense, but in a literal one. We cannot calculate what we lost because we no longer know what was there. This is a different kind of catastrophe from the demographic one, but it is related. The destruction of knowledge was not accidental. It was a deliberate policy, rooted in the belief that indigenous ways of understanding the world were not merely different but dangerous, that they represented a spiritual threat to the colonial order. Destroying the books was a way of destroying the intellectual foundation of the civilizations that produced them, of making it harder for future generations to remember who they had been before the Spanish arrived. And yet, here is the remarkable thing. The knowledge did not entirely disappear. It survived in fragments, in oral traditions, in the practices of communities that maintained their ways of life in the margins of the colonial system. Some of it was recorded by sympathetic Spanish priests who, unlike Diego de Landa, believed that indigenous knowledge was worth preserving. Bernardino de Sahagún spent decades interviewing Aztec elders and compiling the Florentine Codex, an extraordinary encyclopedic record of Aztec life, culture, medicine, and history. It survived, and it is still being studied by scholars today. Indigenous communities themselves survived. Despite the catastrophic population losses of the 16th century, the peoples of the Americas were not erased. They adapted, they resisted, they preserved what they could, and they rebuilt. Today, there are millions of people in the Americas who are descended from the civilizations that Columbus's voyages disrupted, who speak indigenous languages, who maintain indigenous traditions, and who are actively engaged in the work of recovering and revitalizing what was nearly lost. This recovery is one of the most important and least told stories in contemporary history. In Bolivia, the government has made indigenous languages official. In Mexico, Nahuatl, the language of the Aztecs, is spoken by over 1 million people. In Guatemala, the Maya calendar is still used alongside the Gregorian one. In Peru, scientists are working with indigenous communities to document traditional agricultural knowledge that turns out to be relevant to the challenges of climate change and food security in ways that no one fully anticipated. The knowledge that survived the fires and the epidemics and the centuries of colonial suppression is turning out to be genuinely useful, not as a romantic artifact of a lost world, but as a living body of understanding about how to inhabit specific landscapes sustainably. The Inca terracing systems that were abandoned after the conquest are being restored in some parts of the Andes, because they turn out to be more effective at managing water and preventing erosion than the methods that replaced them. The biodiversity of crops that indigenous farmers maintained for thousands of years is now recognized as a crucial resource for global food security in a changing climate. This is not a story of simple redemption, of a wound healed, a wrong righted, a history resolved. The consequences of 1492 are still unfolding. The inequalities created by 5 centuries of colonial extraction are still visible in the economic and political structures of the Americas. The communities most affected by those inequalities are, in many cases, still the communities whose ancestors were most directly harmed by what Columbus set in motion. But it is a story of persistence, of the refusal of human beings to be entirely erased, even when the forces arrayed against them were overwhelming. And that persistence is itself a historical fact, as real, as significant, and as worth knowing as any of the facts about ships and trade routes and silver mines. Columbus sailed west in 1492, looking for a route to Asia, and found something that neither he nor anyone in the Old World knew existed. He was wrong about what he had found, wrong about the size of the earth, and wrong in his belief that the people he encountered were his to command. He was also courageous, skilled, and consequential in ways that permanently altered the trajectory of human history. The world he set in motion is a world of extraordinary complexity, of foods and languages and peoples and ideas mixed together in ways that would have been unimaginable before his voyage, of inequalities and injustices that trace their roots directly to the violence of the colonial system he helped establish, and of resiliences and recoveries that speak to something stubborn and enduring in human beings across every culture and every era. To look at Columbus clearly is to look at all of this at once, not to excuse the harm, not to deny the achievement, not to pretend that the story is simpler than it is. History rarely offers us clean heroes or clean villains. What it offers, if we look carefully enough, is understanding. And understanding of how we got here, of what was lost along the way, of what survived, and of what might still be possible, is the most valuable thing history has to give. That is what this channel is here to do. If this video gave you something to think about, A new angle on a story you thought you knew, a question you had not considered before, a sense of the scale and the weight of what 500 years of history actually contains. Then it has done its job. Leave a comment and tell me which part of this story surprised you most. Was it the Columbian exchange and its agricultural consequences? The story of Bartolomé de las Casas? The burning of the Maya books? The fact that Columbus died still insisting he had reached Asia? Every answer tells me something about what matters to you, and that shapes what this channel makes next. If you're not yet subscribed, now is a good moment. This channel covers exactly these kinds of stories, the ones that are bigger and stranger and more consequential than they first appear, the ones where the full picture changes how you see the present as well as the past. And if you want to follow this thread further, the next video is already there waiting for you. It picks up almost exactly where this one ends. In the years just after Columbus, when the world he had opened was still being mapped, still being fought over, and still being understood. The story does not stop in 1506. It is just getting started.